Welcome to Sum It Up, Session 16. I read it so you don't have to. In this case, we're talking about a very important topic, which was researched by 3 boys from Indonesia. They called the title of their research, Overview of Self-Esteem and Adolescent Behavior That Do Self-Injury. This was a case study. It was qualitative research. And in this study, they found that there's a major problem in schools and that 15% of students are involved in self-harm. They also understood that self-harm is related to self-esteem, but really to what extent, they were not very sure. So these 3 boys, they got together, they decided that they would do a qualitative research study in which they interviewed and they, they did some observations with 3 high school students aged 13 to 15. They did not really necessarily name their research questions within this, but essentially they were looking at finding out what kinds of self-harm, or not necessarily what types of self-harm, but what are the overall impressions that students have of their own self-esteem if they're involved in self-harm. So they were very purposeful about the students that they gathered for their research. Again, they chose 3 adolescents aged 13 to 15 who were involved in self-injury, and they were very specific about that as well. They had to either be involved in slashing, inhaling, or hitting themselves. So they ended up taking those 3. They did in-depth research by interviewing them, and then also they did an observation. At the end of that, they triangulated the data to come to some conclusions. The review of literature really discussed 3 main ideas. The first one being, what is the adolescent period? And they talked a little bit about how the adolescent period, being the age range of 13 through 18, can be a very difficult time in a child's life, and that problems often arise during this time due to social and cultural conditions. The next piece that they talked about was what self-harm is. They described self-harm as the behavior that is intentional suffering and is not socially acceptable. Self-behavior is done by injuring the body without suicidal intention. So it was a big deal that they really discussed that, because I think there's a lot of difference between self-injury where there is suicidal intention versus not suicidal intention. So for the purposes of this study, that definition is really important, that these students did not have suicidal intention. They list some causes of reasons that kids are carrying out self-injury because of things that they experienced when they were younger, including violence, abuse, sexual abuse. And then they also talked about just genetic issues, basically depression, bipolar, borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia. And from there, they went from talking about self-esteem to talking about they talked about self-injury, and then they talked about self-esteem, and then how those 2 related. So they shared that self-esteem is an individual assessment of what one has achieved by analyzing how far the behavior has fulfilled the ideal of self. They went on to describe some of the behaviors that people with low self-esteem exhibit, including criticizing themselves or others, decreasing productivity, destructive, directed at others, disturbances in dealing with others, feeling themselves important in excess even, feeling that they're unable, feelings of guilt, irritability, anger, negative feelings of their own body, pessimistic outlook on life, just a lot of things that are pretty common knowledge about self-esteem. And then they talked about how self-esteem potentially relates to self-harm. And then that kind of led to the discussion of their research design, the people that they were going to use for their research design, the data that they wanted to collect, including those observations and the interviews. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 subjects, if I can remember them. So subject number 1 had parents that were recently divorced. He says that he hurt himself as a form of resentment to parents in the form of slashing his arms. And he also says that he feels inferior about academics. His parents put a lot of pressure on him to do well, and he can tell that he doesn't do as well as peers. So feelings of inferiority were described when it came to his grades. Like I said, pressure from parents academically. So overall, basically this student had forms of self-harm due to family dysfunction and relationships within the family, and then just feeling those pressures from parents. Subject number 2 did not have a great relationship with parents, actually, so he was lacking in parental attention. And then when he did get attention from them, they were criticizing his behavior because he does have difficulty academically. And then teachers were also interviewed, which I realized throughout this study was very interesting, is that friends, teachers, and parents were interviewed. And I thought that would take a lot to get cleared through the IRB, maybe. Being able to talk to them about the child's self-harm behaviors. I thought that was kind of interesting. But teachers explained that he did have difficulty academically and paying attention, so he felt constantly criticized. He does have a desire to have friends, but people are more bullies to him than anything. And another issue that led to self-harm behaviors was his appearance, as they noted that his face looked different, essentially. And then the third performed the self-harm behavior of inhaling glue due to social issues. And the major social issue they talked about was comparing himself to others academically, and then not being able to succeed academically. I think it's also important to note that these 3 that performed these self-injurious behaviors said that they never felt sick. They would often hide their actions from people, especially their parents. They also said that they had feelings of guilt, sadness, and anger after each time that they performed a self-harming behavior. And some of the main reasons that they would perform those behaviors kind of in the moment was to avoid negative feelings. It gave them a feeling of satisfaction or pleasure, and it was another way to punish themselves and their own worthlessness. Okay, so bear with me while we look at the discussions a little bit, because a lot of different authors were cited. Essentially, some of the results that came from this study were cooperative with Wibissono's study in 2018, which explained that the causes of self-injurious behavior were caused by external factors, were social pressure, both parents, family, and others, while internal factors such as loss, low self-esteem, and trauma. Those were major factors in another study. Several other studies, including Mrunk in 2012, illustrated that individuals who have low self-esteem tend to have characteristics of hypersensitivity, so they are unstable and lack self-confidence. Another thing that also puts students at higher risk for developing self-injury behaviors is just having a bad experience in their childhood. And then the American Psychiatric Association explains that one form of body dysmorphic disorder is excessive distortion of the body image, and that can lead to, that there is a link between self-esteem and body dysmorphic disorder, such as the subject number 2 who had some body dysmorphic issues. And then which led to self-harm and feeling bad and jealous about the way other people looked. Overall, the conclusions show that individuals who engage in self-injury behaviors with the kind of slashing, inhaling, or even hitting themselves have low self-esteem due to factors from personal, social, parents, friends, and academics. This is so important, I think, in my current research about the Student of the Month program, because we really look at how competition and then how people compare themselves. With the social comparison theory, we talk about how people compare themselves upward to individuals that have more or do better or thought of as society as better people. And in the case of students, most likely students that are performing better academically. So I think that my research regarding this Student of the Month program and kids, obviously not getting it, having higher feelings of inferiority, I think there's definitely a possibility that the programs I'm talking about can have not only a relationship to the feelings of inferiority, but potentially even self-harm, which is, probably for a different study even. Something I would have liked to see, and this is just because I do, like I said before, I do really like numbers. I do see definitely how having all of these quotes from the individuals in the experiment is helpful in understanding how they feel about themselves, their own perspectives, their thoughts and feelings. I also think it'd be interesting just to do a correlational study to find out very specifically which behaviors or which self-injurious behaviors are performed based on like what academic activities or which academic struggles, I guess. And really, are we in schools more of a, playing a role in why kids are self-harming, or is it more from home? Is it more genetic? I think all of that would be interesting to see in a correlational study. Overall, I enjoyed reading this article. I think it is important that we continue to really look into reasons that students are self-harming, because I think that there's a lot of stigma based on the fact that people think they do it for attention, and I truly don't think that's the case, especially when you read the results of this study. Self-harm, depression, anxiety, those types of things are on the rise in the United States. So I think really any research we can do to try to understand what we as a school are doing to cause that behavior or contribute to that behavior, and then what we can do to make sure that we stop doing those things that we maybe are even doing that are contributing to it. So lots of good information, something else to think about. And then next week I will see you on Sum It Up as we read about competition in education.